Hello there. Hi, can anybody hear me? Hello? Right. Oh, good. Okay, you can hear. Lovely. So very good evening to all of you and welcome to the Society for Theatre Research and for the first of our 2021 lecture series. Now, some of you may have had the pleasure last Sunday of the Frank Matcham Society's talk by Richard Norman about Matcham's proteges Bertie Crewe and William Sprague. And what a wonderful talk that was too. So tonight we are also on Zoom, and I'm hoping that technology will be kind to us, or rather kind to me. But just to remind you how this works, your cameras and microphones are currently muted during the lecture. However, at the end, I'll be taking some questions through the chat function, and that is the white box up at the side, or for some of you, that will also be the sort of cartoon bubble at the bottom of your screen. Ah, Richard's just raised his hand. Yeah. Hi, Richard. Do you want to do you want to come in with something? No? Okay. Very good. So I think Richard is acknowledging his presence here. So I'm going to stay up here as the little figure in the box so that you can enjoy these images from our two plays, The Octoroon and An Octoroon. Now, off we go. I just need to see how I advance this. Hold on a moment. Right. Okay, the title of today's lecture or talk, I'm going to be quite informal, is called The Fatal Drop, Body, Race and Gender in Boucicault's The Octoroon and Branden Jacobs-Jenkins An Octoroon. A little bit about me. I am a scholar practitioner. I work not only as a theater maker, but also as somebody who researches and writes about theater. In particularly, my work has been about the post-empire diaspora, particularly work on Black British, British Asian, and Asian American theater makers. And I'm presently the academic leader at Performance Preparation Academy in Guildford, whom I would like to thank very, very much for their support of my work during Black History Month. So here's the overview of what we are going to be looking at. I'm sort of comparing two plays here, both treating the subject of the racialized body and both indeed sharing a plot line. So the first is The Octoroon by Dion Boucicault, and I'll be looking at the racialized body in Boucicault's The Octoroon. Then we'll be moving on to Branden Jacobs-Jenkins An Octoroon as a form of meta-melodrama, the term that many of the critics have noted is interesting about his work, and looking then at the racialized body in An Octoroon by Boucicault. Not by Boucicault, sorry, by Branden Jacobs-Jenkins. So let's just begin with Boucicault himself. And this is the title page of The Octoroon, or Life in Louisiana, written in 1859. And this particular work has an interesting history, both on both sides of the Atlantic, as we shall see in a few minutes. It was also based on a novel called The Quadroon. And that was, it's interesting that Boucicault changed the protagonist from somebody who was a quarter Black to somebody who was an eighth Black. In other words, the heroine, Zoe, whom we see here, is somebody who ostensibly could pass for white. So the Octoroon in the United States. The US premiere took place on December 6, 1859 at the Winter Garden Theater in New York City. By this time, Boucicault is already known as somebody who was a specialist in quite spectacular theater and exotic locations. So this production's handbill proudly advertises, quote, a slave auction and the burning on stage of the steamboat Magnolia. This performance takes place at a very controversial time in the history of the United States, because late on the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 21 armed followers stole into the town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, what is now West Virginia, while most of its residents were asleep. Now, amongst the men were 3 free blacks, 1 free slave, and 1 fugitive or runaway slave. The group hoped to spark a rebellion of freed slaves and then to lead an army of emancipation. And we should also remember that Virginia itself was associated with the Southern cause, with the slavery cause. This was, of course, seen as remarkably serious, and Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Now, just 4 days later, the Octoroon has its first performance. A mere 2 years later, the American Civil War will begin. But at the time of its premiere, tensions over the slavery question are running very, very high. And one might surmise that Boucicault, ever the showman, was keen to capitalize upon this. Now, not everybody welcomed this play. The day before it opened, the New York Herald ran an editorial called, quote, abolition on and off the stage, unquote, and described the work as a work of, quote, treason and disunion. And here we see probably the illustration of what is maybe the most famous scene in the Octoroon, where you see the villain McCloskey, who's purchased Zoe. And Zoe up here, interestingly, dressed in white. And McCloskey is being challenged by George Peyton, heir to the Terrebonne estate, and one of the overseers. So what happens to the Octoroon when it goes to England? This is quite interesting. The Octoroon in Britain has a slightly different fate. Now, reports of the New York performance said that there were police present in the first night, and Agnes Robertson was Boucicault's wife, and she played the role of Zoe. Now, reportedly, she received death threats because her performance as Zoe was seen to be a rallying cry to the abolitionist cause. The couple, of course, returned with this immensely successful show to the UK. And just to give you an idea of how successful it was the most popular antebellum melodrama in the US after Uncle Tom's Cabin. There were 7 road companies touring the Octoroon following its New York premiere. So the first performance in the UK was at the New Royal Adelphi Theatre in London. And I will talk about this playbill in a minute, but this in itself attracted quite a lot of publicity, not only because of this, to the British, controversial, but also exotic topic. The Illustrated London News on November 30th, 1861, reviewed the first performance. And here we see again the famous scene of the slave auction. Now, interestingly, the bulk of this article deals with the sensation scene of the burning of the steamboat Magnolia, but it also notes that the audience was not entirely happy at seeing the graphic death of Zoe, who poisons herself, at the end of the Octoroon. So by the 332nd performance, and this is where this playbill comes from, we not only have the Octoroon running with the Colleen Bawn, an earlier play by Boucicault, but Boucicault has now changed the ending. It's reading this. Mr. Boucicault begs to acknowledge the hourly receipt of many letters entreating that the termination of the Octoroon should be modified and the slave heroine saved from an unhappy end. He cannot resist the kind feelings expressed throughout this correspondence, nor refuse compliance with a request so easily granted. Well, what does he do to this? He changes the tragic ending of Zoe's suicide to a happy one, where Zoe and George Peyton, the heir, escape the villainous McCloskey running through the swamps of Louisiana, and they are united, no doubt, to live happily ever after. I'm moving now to kind of the theoretical basis of this talk, and that is I'm looking at both these plays through the lens of the racialized body. That's a concept from cultural theorist Sarah Ahmed. And the main premise that she makes is that race, to some extent, the value of race is actually socially constructed. And I'm just going to read this section. The term racialized bodies invites us to think of the multiple processes whereby bodies come to be seen as having a racial identity. One's racial identity is not simply determined, for example, by the fact of one's skin color. Racialization is a process that takes place in time and space. Race is an effect of this process rather than its original cause. So, in the case of skin color, racialization involves a process of investing skin color with meaning, such that Black and white come to function not as descriptions of skin color, but as racial identities. And I think when we look at the slavery period in the South and in the United States, this is fairly obvious that race in itself has no particular signification until it's mapped onto a Black-white binary. And in the Octoroon, the meaning of race is mapped to whiteness as normative. So consequently, whiteness becomes a standard, and it is invested with markers such as high status, freedom, personal agency, and moreover becomes the standard by which other ethnicities are measured. In Boucicault, the racialized bodies, I would say, follow three particular aspects. The first is the play outlines the Black-white binary of inequality. The second is the racialized body is embodied through stereotypes about Black people. And the third, shown through the heroine, is that race is considered not socially constructed, but immutable. Now, here is an illustration from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which very poignantly shows this inequality of Black and white. The overseer, Simon Legree, over here, is about to kick Uncle Tom. And of course, the illustrator has put in Uncle Tom crouching in a bed of cotton balls. In other words, the value that he brings to the plantation is this cotton, and he is there lying virtually on the same level as it. Let's look at some of these stereotypes within the Octoroon. Pete is the overseer in the play. He is sort of what you would call the head slave, or the person who seems to have some authority, at least moral authority over them. And Pete is an example of the Tom stereotype. The Tom stereotype is named after Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, which was done by Beatrice Stowe as an abolitionist. The Tom is faithful to the master in all circumstances. He is normally a house slave working alongside other slaves to serve the master and his family. He is happy and submissive. And in the case of Uncle Tom here, he is Christian and forgiving of the wrongs done to him. Now, this particular illustration is interesting because Uncle Tom is befriended by a daughter of the plantation, little Ava, and Tom learns about the Bible, and the Bible teaches him to forgive Simon Legree and other people who are abusing him. He literally turns the other cheek. So in the Octoroon, Pete is an example of a Tom. Interestingly, in this play, there are 17 uses of the word, and I'm going to say it, nigger or niggers. Now, of these, 11 of them are said by Pete. Pete is an example of what Frantz Fanon would term internalized oppression. Fanon's work on this has been outlined in his Black Skins, White Masks. In other words, Pete views himself and his fellow slaves in racist terms. Pete refers to his colleagues and their children as critters, as vermin. He says they weren't born, they sprung up from a sassafras tree. His subjection is viewed as loyalty to the family. And when the family falls on hard times and the estate is lost, Pete talks to his fellow slaves, advising them that they have to uphold the family standard on the auction block. This is the quote here. "We've got to be sold for de pride of de family. Let every darky look his best for the judge's sake. That old man's so good to us, and that old woman. So dem strangers from New Orleans shall say, dem's happy darkies, dem's a fine set of niggers. Everyone say when he's sold, Lord bless this here family I'm going out of, and send me as good a home." Okay, kind of hard to swallow now. Well, in addition to Pete, there is a quadroon child, in other words, a child who's 1/4 Black, called Paul. And Paul conforms to a happy darky stereotype. He is beloved by Captain Rats, the steamboat captain, and his crew, because he comes to the boat, dances and sings, and they give him picayunis, which are small coins worth about 5 US cents. Another non-Black ethnic stereotype that appears is his friend Wanote. And Wanote is an alcoholic Indian who is deemed to be uncivilized because he doesn't really speak any form of English. He speaks his own language, which Paul, interestingly, is able to understand. Of course, the most perhaps interesting example of the Black stereotypes in both the Octoroon and An Octoroon is the tragic mulatto or mulatta. They are generally portrayed as victims of mixed race heritage with one white and one Black or part Black parent. Almost always these fictional characters are female. They tend to be attractive, well-mannered, quite often educated, but the tragedy lies in their Black blood. Now, Isaac and Rosa, whom you see at the left here, this is a studio card from the Free Schools of Louisiana, and they were actually exhibited as an example of basically an octoroon and a Black child from the same, it's assumed to be from the same parent. The cultural critic Carla Peterson contends that as the object of the white male gaze, the mulatta, quote, renders female sexuality available, legitimizing the act of seduction and rape. And this indeed is what we see in the Octoroon, is that she is viewed as attractive, but attractive in a rather sexualized way, particularly by the villain McCloskey, who wants to make her his mistress. Now, Zoe is not a lone figure in the literature of the antebellum South. The mulatta is a recurrent figure in Victorian literature. For example, Charles Kingsley's 1857 novel, 2 years ago, has a mulatta character. Interestingly, Lydia Maria Child's A Romance of the Republic, written in 1867, has an octoroon who goes on to become an opera singer. And of course, Mayne Reid's The Quadroon or A Lover's Adventures in Louisiana, 1856, was itself one of the sources for the octoroon. When we examine Zoe, her progress in terms of status and agency is very interesting. She is Judge Peyton's illegitimate daughter by his quadroon slave, and therefore she's 1/8 Black, and the text implies that she can pass as white. The Peyton couple are childless, and Mrs. Peyton loves Zoe and raises her like her own daughter. Zoe is well-spoken, beautiful, educated, and admired by all. The plantation's 2 Yankee overseers, McCloskey and Scudder, are in love with her, as indeed is George Peyton, Mrs. Peyton's nephew. George has recently returned from France to manage the nearly bankrupt Terrebonne estate. At the start of Act 1, Zoe is shown to have the privileges and status of a white woman. Mrs. Peyton has given her, quote, the education of a lady, unquote. She goes out riding with George, and she socializes with the heiress Dora Sunnyside. Although the villain McCloskey refers to her later in Act 1 as the octoroon, and he does this in a rather sexualized context. Initially, this doesn't seem to matter to the other characters, except, of course, for Zoe. Zoe self-identifies as a Black person. And when George Peyton proposes marriage to her, she feels compelled to reject him because the law forbids mixed race marriages. George tries to counter this by saying, well, they could go to France where he used to live, and there they would be free of the law. But for Zoe, race is immutable because it is embodied, literally in the blood and in the flesh. In the same scene, she draws George's attention to the, quote, bluish tinge, unquote, in her fingernails and in the whiteness of her eyes. For Zoe, her cursed status is marked on the body, is visible, and cannot be changed. And this is a very famous speech from the Octoroon that also gets repeated by Branden Jacobs-Jenkins in his version of it. That is the ineffaceable curse of Cain, of the blood that feeds my heart. One drop in 8 is black, red, bright red as the rest may be. That one drop poisons all the flood. Those 7 bright drops give me love like yours, hope like yours, ambition like yours, life hung with passions like dewdrops on the morning flowers. But the one black drop gives me despair, for I'm an unclean thing, forbidden by the laws. I'm an octoroon. Now, it's very interesting, the language here. It's, referring to the curse of Cain the murderer, references to poison here, references to despair, uncleanliness. In other words, this language plays into all the language about racial inferiority, the uncleanness of Black people. And for her, it is a curse that she cannot ever get out of. Well, Zoe's status and the perception of her value shifts radically. It's discovered that she is not indeed free, and that the judge's free papers are invalid. The estate goes under the hammer, the auction, and the slaves are to be sold along with the other, and she is to be sold along with the other Terrebonne slaves. So Zoe's status agency, and relative freedom virtually disappear. She becomes, like her fellow slaves, a commodity on the auction block, but a much more valuable one because of the exoticism of her light skin color. Now, it's very interesting that Agnes Robertson, Boucicault's wife, who played the role of Zoe, was, of course, a Caucasian woman. And we have this sort of interesting race impersonation here of a white woman playing a mixed race character. Now, of course, the text draws attention to these markers of mixed raceness, these markers of being an octoroon, but they would not, of course, have been visible on the body of Agnes Robertson, the actress who played Zoe. Now, there is a sort of, what we could say, maybe a cure for the problem of being an octoroon, and that cure, of course, is death. Zoe returns to Dido, her mammy, and asks her for medicine. Now, Dido warns her that to take the whole bottle would be to poison herself. And while Dido sees that Zoe wishes to commit suicide after being sold to the villain McCluskey, she allows Zoe to go. And this sort of release is her acknowledgement that the only freedom that one can have from the racialized body is to literally leave the body through death. I'm moving on now to Branden Jacobs-Jenkins An Octoroon, his satirical take, or some people call it that, of Boucicault's play. An Octoroon premiered off-Broadway at Soho Rep on April 23rd, 2014, and closed on June 8th of the same year. It was directed by Sarah Benson. And this particular production was critically acclaimed. It won an Obie Award for the Best New American Play in 2014. In his review for the New York Times, Ben Brantley called the play, quote, "this decade's most eloquent theatrical statement on race in America today." The production then transferred to the Theater for a New Audience, Polanski Shakespeare Center in Brooklyn, where it ran from February 14th to March 29th, 2015. Like its predecessor, the Octoroon, An Octoroon, had many subsequent productions. The first outside of New York was in 2015 at the Mixed Blood Theater Company in Minneapolis. The 2016 production by Company One in Boston also featured an interactive melodrama element. That is, audiences were encouraged to hiss the villain and cheer for the good guys, and oddly enough, were also encouraged to bid during the slave auction. They were told when they got their tickets that the ticket also entitled them to bid on a slave. Now, that itself is a sort of interesting meta-theatrical conceit. In the same year, there was a production by the Wilma Theater in Philadelphia, the Obama Theater in Cleveland, Ohio, and we'll see a clip of that later. In 2017, it had its West Coast premiere at Berkeley Rep in California, and its Canadian premiere at the Shaw Festival. 2017 also marks the first year of the first production, rather, in the UK. And from May 18th to July the 1st, 2017, An Octoroon was performed at the Orange Tree Theatre in Richmond, London, in a production directed by Ned Bennett and designed by Georgia Lowe. In July 2018, it was transferred to the National Theatre, playing at the Dorfman Theatre there, from June 7th to July 18th. The Time Out review of the 2018 production called it a, quote, maddeningly clever and provocative piece of metadrama. And what many critics noticed was that this revision of Boucicault could be classified as metadrama, or indeed meta-melodrama. That is, theater which is calling attention to its theatricality and artificiality. And I would argue that that's done through 5 ways. The first is a theatrical frame which places the octoroon within the theatrical frame of an octoroon. Secondly, through theatrically self-referential features such as intertextuality. Thirdly, through the doubling of roles both within and without the frame. Fourthly, by disrupting the stage action of the octoroon. And finally, by the use of blackface performance conventions that were current at the time of the original The Octoroon. Firstly, the theatrical frame. Although An Octoroon retains much of the Boucicault dialogue, this is lodged within a contemporary frame described as, quote, an empty, unfortunate-looking theater, where a Black playwright, BJJ, the same initials as Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, is having a problem casting his production of The Octoroon. Secondly, it is theatrically self-referential. BJJ appears initially in his underwear, ironically declaring, "I'm a Black playwright. I have no idea what that means." BJJ complains that white actors are creating a big casting problem for him. They don't want to play slave owners. And I quote, "The minute you ask a white guy to play a racist whose racism isn't, quote, complicated by some monologue, where he's like, quote, I don't mean to be racist, it's just complicated, unquote, he doesn't return your phone calls." Furthermore, BJJ notes that Black actors are supposed to be thrilled with the chance to play reductive contemporary stereotypes. Quote, football playing, illiterate, drug addict, magical Negro, Iraq vet with PTSD. This lament is broken by the entrance of the playwright, aka Dion Boucicault, who complains that he has been forgotten by a contemporary audience. And the encounter between these two we'll be seeing in the clip from the Kansas City production by the Unicorn Theater. Thirdly, BJJ and the playwright double, or in BJJ's case, triple. And they exist both within the octoroon melodrama and also in the framing device of An Octoroon. For example, the playwright also plays the alcoholic Indian Wanoti. This is interesting because Boucicault himself played this role on stage, so I've got a bit of intertextuality here. And the actions of the playwright, who refers to himself as fecking drunk, allude to the drunken Irishman stereotype in 19th century popular theater. Both these actors dip in and out of character to comment on the stage action of The Octoroon, notably in a scene where they stop the action of the play to discuss how to do a sensation scene. This, of course, alludes to one of Boucicault's theatrical trademarks. His melodramas featured such things as onstage fires, explosions, at-sea rescues, which thrilled the melodrama audience with spectacle and heightened emotion. Fourthly, Boucicault's production employed both blackface and redface makeup. An Octoroon shows these theatrical practices of racial impersonation that were common during the 19th century. For example, blackface minstrel shows, blacking up, and also the comic aspects of the white characters are demonstrated, one would argue, by Black characters whiting up like a whiteface clown tradition to make fun of the Caucasian characters in this play. Now I'm going to run a clip from the Unicorn Theater's production done in Kansas City in 2016. And this shows the opening of the scene with BJJ whiting up, and also how some of these racial impersonation conventions are used in this production?
Well, folks, it's time to kick it old school. Well, folks.
Moving on to the last part of my talk, which is how the racialized body is represented in An Octoroon. Just going back for a moment at this clip, the Kansas City production, like many of them, the actors put on the makeup on stage, and it's applied in such a way that the actor's own skin tone is very visible. Now, the onstage whiting up or redding up by BJJ and the playwright create a liminal racial space, which heightens the original ethnicity of the actor and also is asking us to blur the racial boundaries in accepting at the same time the ethnicity of the actor and the ethnicity of their roles as white George Payton and Native American Wanoti. It's interesting that in almost all productions, the representation of these racial stereotypes is mainly with the male characters. As you can see here in this still from the Orange Tree, the female characters are not made up in any way. In fact, they appear as what one might call real people. The racialized body in An Octoroon has, I'd say, 4 elements. It counters Boucicault's claim that, or rather Boucicault's play's claim, that race is immutable. The blacking up, redding up, whiting up shows that race is not immutable, but formative. The nature of the metadrama diminishes the tragedy of the racialized body through the 2 characters of Minnie and Dido. A question emerges about these racial stereotypes. Is it undercutting them, really, in a positive way? Or is it actually just confirming racial stereotypes that exist and perhaps are still influential in our world? If we look here at the representation of Black stereotypes here, we have Pete, and Pete is shown as a kind of Uncle Tom character, complete with beard, a sort of woolly-headed caricature of Uncle Tom. Now, Branden Jacobs-Jenkins repeats Pete's speech from The Octoroon, where he exhorts the slaves to make the family proud as they go on the auction block. He tells Minnie and Dido to be, quote, happy darkies, but finds out that all the other slaves have managed to run away during the chaos that has ensued on the sale of the plantation. Now here we have Dido and Minnie, and Jacobs-Jenkins enlarges the roles of these 2 original minor characters. They form part of the metadramatic frame, commenting on the action and offering an ironic perspective of life in the slave quarters. Zoe's characterization remains the same as it is in Boucicault. She is still the tragic mulatta. Dido and Minnie self-consciously perform Black stereotypes when and if it suits them. They speak in dialect when the white characters are with them, but they revert to contemporary African-American speech when they're together. However, it has been argued that Dido and Minnie are not necessarily figures that are wholly positive. They may also be perceived as stereotypes of the hypersexualized mouthy Black girl. At the slave auction, they flirt with Captain Rats in the hopes that he'll buy them, and they envisage life on his steamboat as being one where they will be surrounded by hunky Black men who are eager for sex. Yet there is a humorous and ironic comment on the situation of slaves and the recurrent feature in abolitionist literature of slaves trying to free themselves and running away. One of them says, what are you going to do once you free? You're just going to walk up in somebody's house and be like, hey, I'm a slave. Help me. The actions of Dido and Minnie are themselves really quite interesting in this production from the Dobama Theater in Cleveland, Ohio. And here also the actors speak about their perceptions of this play and its relevance to American society.
An octoroon technically means a person that's 1/8 Black.
Well, the play An Octoroon premiered in 2014. That's when it won the Obie Award for Best New Play. And it's an adaptation of Dion Boucicault's The Octoroon, which was an incredibly famous play during its time, which was like the 1850s. So it's pre-Civil War, and it did document what happened during slavery. And it was a melodrama. And Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, who is the playwright for An Octoroon, decided to not only look at this original piece, but try to contextualize it within today, not just our current political situation, but also our current theatrical styles.
%90 of the melodrama is the actual text from the original The Octoroon. But BJJ, the actual playwright, throws in some little gems and changes a few words. So that's where the other 10% comes. He did change a lot of the language of the slaves. So he made their language contemporary, which is a really interesting choice.
You get an opportunity with An Octoroon to see, from my perspective, you get to see what it was really like for slaves to just have a normal conversation, an everyday conversation. And I love that with this adaptation, BJJ says that nobody knows what slaves talked like.
Well, I saw Priscilla's drunk ass last night. She probably hung over. She is such a mess. Where you see her? Well, she came by the servants' quarters to get a drink and to say goodbye. Say goodbye for what? Well, I don't know. Maybe she got sold. They don't let you say goodbye when you get sold. Well, maybe she's taking a trip. I don't know. A trip to where, Minnie? Slaves don't take trips.
So it was very, very contemporary, and he interweaves those into Dion Boucicault's original The Octoroon.
We're living in 2016. There's a lot happening, and this play speaks to a lot of what is happening in America in 2016.
But yeah, it's a tornado.
So before I move on to the critical reception in the UK, just want to go back to that clip of Minnie and Dido there. They are from our world in terms of their language, in terms of the things they talk about. But they're also, I think, significantly a counterpoint to Zoe's dilemma, which is seen as tragic in Boucicault, but becomes ridiculous in An Octoroon. Minnie says, quote, that Zoe is such a mess. That bitch is just crazy. That's what happens when you hang out with all these white people all the damn time. Dido is offended that Zoe perceives Dido as a racial stereotype, as a mammy, casting Dido as the matronly African-American Aunt Jemima type. Minnie advises the worried Dido, if Zoe's light-skinned ass want to call you old and go and poison herself over some white man, then you need to let her go and do that and move on. You're not your job. Now, interestingly, of course, the Octoroon ends with Zoe's suicide, but An Octoroon leaves it ambiguous, and it ends with a figure from African-American folklore, the trickster figure of Brer Rabbit, carrying the gavel of the auction and the tomahawk belonging to the Native American. Now, the critical reception of this is really interesting because many of the critics are focusing on the theatrical innovation, the theatrical illusion, says Mrs. Billington, deconstruction of racial representation. That's an interesting one that other critics have challenged. Laughing in the face of racism, also something that critics have challenged, such as Heather Marks. Heather Marks says that, acknowledges that white, black, and red face are used, and that they are part of a history of misrepresenting race on stage. But this is where it gets interesting. She says, while whiteface reverses the imperial gaze, the use of blackface and redface in the play brings the original racist stereotypes back into circulation. Well, I'm going to close with this rather interesting series of thoughts, but I'm going to close with Branden Jacobs-Jenkins himself. And he won the MacArthur Fellowship that is offered to outstanding creatives in 2016 at the very young age of 31. And here are his words about his work.
I've always believed that one of the most incredible and important things about the theater and all art really is that we're creating a safe space for all feelings, but especially ugly feelings. My name is Branden Jacobs-Jenkins and I'm a playwright. I think we can't deny that we are human beings who feel fear, who feel disgust, and I think that the theater is supposed to be the space to rehearse those feelings, feel yourself feeling those feelings, and then make peace with them and understand what they're about. I have always been very bookish. I've always read a lot. I've always loved to write, but also I grew up in a community where theater was a very present thing socially. In college, I guess I realized that those two things might actually go together, and that's when I began sort of dabbling in writing plays. Neighbors, Appropriate, and Octoroon are not technically a trilogy, but they do feel of a piece and of a period. And they're mostly linked in that it was me sort of investigating a historic relationship between American theatrical forms and like the question of blackness in society.
They likes it when we be like that.
In my play Neighbors, I decided I wanted to write sort of a play that encapsulated the history of blackness in the theater. So I began at the farthest pole, which was Blackface Minstrelsy, which is really the first appearance of blackness in the American theater as we recognize it was white men in blackface pretending to be black. I have a play called Appropriate, which premiered at the Signature Theater, that was me attempting to understand what the American family drama really is, and I was exploring the ways that whiteness is essentially encoded in ideas of Americanness and family. I have a play called An Octoroon, which was an adaptation, or a radical adaptation, of a melodrama from 1859, like an actual melodrama set on a slave plantation. What's amazing about melodrama is it's the science of theater, whereas like a bunch of French guys, they basically mapped out how to make an audience feel the same thing over time. I would say that all of my work is sort of fed by a question. It's fed by a need to like understand the world and why the world is what it is and why I feel the way I feel in the world. And I think that I really believe in the power of this form. You want to incite connections. You want people to leave the theater looking at life differently. But at the most elemental level, all I want is for people to leave with something to mull over, you know, and leave with the bravery to actually try to connect, try to understand, you know, to see each other in each other. I've always believed.
So we've come to the end of our presentation. This is just some of the sources that I've used, and it's the whole discussion of race and representation in the 19th century is a rich and very, very diverse field that it just continues to fascinate me. I just want to thank you for joining us tonight at the Society for Theatre Research lecture series. But before we move on to questions, I want to just remind you of our December event. We won't be able to have our usual Christmas jolly at the Art Workers Guild, but we do have a very special treat for you. And that's an online rehearsed reading of the very first stage version of Nicholas Nickleby, adapted by Edward Sterling in 1838. And interestingly, this stage version appeared before Dickens himself had completed the novel. So, big surprises there. And it will be directed by Sue Solomon with a number of the actors who previously performed in the STR rehearsed reading of Frankenstein. I'd just like to thank you all very much for joining us here tonight. And if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to take them on chat. I think now I'm going to stop share. I hope so. Okay, let's see how we go. Right. Hi there. You can type in anything that you'd like, if you like typing in anything or commenting. And I think Harriet is looking after that for us. Oh, thank you. Good evening. Good evening there, Michael Anderson. Presumably all the original, okay, hang on. All the original productions of the Octoroon had white actors blacking up. As far as we can tell, yes, that is the case, because at this time, as far as I can tell, we didn't have historical Black theaters playing in anything as prestigious as certainly the ones that Boucicault's The Octoroon premiered at. The road companies themselves also are likely to be all Caucasian because they traveled through segregated states. Let's see. Can you say something about the radicalization of whiteness and Irishness? Yeah, now this is kind of one that perhaps somebody who's more of a 19th century specialist could be more in depth about, but certainly in a number of popular plays in America, there were Irish stereotypes about drunkenness, dirtiness, etc., that had to do with really an anti-immigrant feeling. The Irish were amongst one of the larger groups of new immigrants. They had come from very poor and even in some case absolutely starving backgrounds, and they were discriminated against. They were seen as also Catholic in a largely Protestant country, and the whole stage Irishman as a drunk, a gambler, an untrustworthy person was sort of proliferated as part of this anti-immigrant sentiment. Oh, racialism, sorry. Or the racialism of the, yeah, of autocorrect. Kate, have I answered your question? Okay, yeah, the significance of Brer Rabbit. Brer Rabbit appears in African American folklore as a trickster figure. He is someone who always gets the better of his superiors. The famous Brer Rabbit story is where he gets caught stealing, and the person who's caught him is going to beat him to a pulp. And he says, well, please just don't throw me in the briar patch. Whatever you do, don't throw me there. And of course, the captor throws him in the briar patch and he runs off and gets off scot-free. Yeah, Boucicault changed it from a quadroon to an octoroon, and that's kind of an interesting thing in itself, because there was a whole kind of a subculture of octoroons passing, octoroons passing over. A quadroon was often called high yellow, 25% black, but still recognizably of African extraction. Whereas by the time you get to octoroons, numbers of them tried to and successfully did pass. It's something that Langston Hughes in the 1920s writes about. Yeah, the Gone with the Wind references. Now, I'm not really sure about that. I know that that the mammy outfit for Dido in some of the productions is almost a replica of the Hattie Jenks costume in Gone with the Wind. So that kind of mammy figure is replicated, at least costume-wise. Michael is asking, you change it from quadroon to octoroon. Yes, to make his wife more credible in the part. Yeah, that as well. And I think also at that time, the so-called exotic nature of the octoroon as this kind of liminal character who's neither black nor white, but possibly could pass over that color bar into being white, was something that fascinated quite a lot of people. Right. Extent to these productions speak beyond Anglo-Saxon culture. Yeah, I don't know, Geraldine, if they have been translated. I mean, it would be very interesting to see what would be made of these outside of Europe, outside of mainly, yeah, Anglo-American or European contexts. But I don't know if anybody has translated it yet. Positions of mixed race characters who could pass as well. Were they an accepted part of American society? And did real people in this situation reveal their racial background? As I mentioned, the notion of passing was a fraught question, not only for mixed race people, but for people who were involved in segregation. There is a lot of literature about passing in the 1920s. Langston Hughes writes about it. Zora Hurston writes about it as well. And oddly enough, in the United States, there's a fair amount of pulp literature about exotic octoroons, with titles like Passing. By and large, if you could pass over the color bar, there was very little advantage for you declaring yourself mixed race. I think when Hughes talks about it, it's basically if people passed, they just hope no one ever found out. Geraldine, to what extent do these productions speak beyond? Okay, I think, yeah, I think, Geraldine, I have, yeah, I think I've addressed the fact that I don't know presently if the if Boucicault or Jacob Jenkins have been translated. I wouldn't be surprised if there were foreign translations of Boucicault, since he was a very, very popular writer at that time. And just as a plug for the University of Kent, Boucicault's papers are actually at the University of Kent for anybody who'd like to follow Boucicault up any further on this. Right. I think does anybody have any other questions, or have we, wow, we've really come to time here. So I think, folks, I'd like to bid you good night and thank you so much for joining me and the Society for Theatre Research at our Zoom launch of the 2020 and 2021 lecture series. And I do hope that you're going to join us for Nicholas Nickleby. Okay, thank you. Right. Bye.